You're watching All 24 News live from Algiers, and I'm your host, Karim Fazakri, and this is the special coverage of the French election 2022. French voters are heading to the polls for the second time in 2 weeks to conclude a presidential election in which incumbent centrist Emmanuel Macron has the advantage in polls over nationalist Marine Le Pen. The candidate's plans are completely opposed. At home, Macron is sticking to his credo of pro-business overhauls, including an increase in the retirement age to foster more work and make the economy more competitive, while Le Pen wants the French to retire even earlier than the current minimum of 62 and promises steep cuts to sales and income taxes to help households. After a televised debate on April 20th, almost all opinion polls predicted that Macron would lead this presidential runoff. However, analysts have warned that the result is far from a foregone conclusion. To talk more about the French election 2022, I am joined live via Skype from Paris, France, by Manuel Pouchelet, university lecturer and geopolitical analyst, along with Abdenour Toumi, journalist at Maghreb Studies, expert at Orsam Center, Turkey, as well as Federica Setugalo, international relations and diplomacy analyst. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. The discussion begins right after this break. And before we delve into discussion, let's follow this report, then we come back.
Polls have opened in French presidential election runoff that is being closely followed around the globe for its potential to redefine France's position in the Western world, the country's approach to immigration, and Europe's relationship with Russia. The last poll average on Friday before the election blackout period showed incumbent President Emmanuel Macron 10 percentage points ahead. A win by far-right challenger Marine Le Pen appears unlikely, though still possible. Among the sources of uncertainty, a Macron victory would mark a rare re-election for an incumbent in a country where voters are known to be unforgiving for their leaders. There is not nearly the same level of enthusiasm for him as when he first ran in 2017, launching his own centrist political movement and becoming France's youngest president. A runoff win by Le Pen would put an entire immigrant populace in charge of the European Union's second biggest economy and its only nuclear power. It would replace a fervent defender of the EU with a long-time critic of the bloc. Le Pen's past admiration for Russian President Vladimir Putin and her recent calls for reconciliation between NATO and Russia have also prompted concerns that a far-right victory would empower a leader who shares Putin's worldview and who could become a key obstacle to Western support for Ukraine. Most of the candidates who failed to qualify for the second round besieged their supporters not to vote for Le Pen. Her hopes now largely rest on the potential for high abstention rates among voters who lean toward Macron.
Let me start with you, Mr. Federica Setugalo. How important is this presidential election in France, and why is it grabbing the attention of foreign media?
Yes, thank you for the opportunity, Karim. Well, before I answer that question, I think it's probably fair to quickly have a look at the position or the stance at where the French democracy is at right now, because that kind of determines where the voters are showing up today at the polling stations. So I believe the signs are there pointing, to an increasingly unhappy democracy at the moment. We're likely to see a repeat of what happened in 2017 when the turnout decreased in the second round and voters casted a record number of blank or spoiled ballots, in protest at the choice of candidates that remain. And so when we observe the results of the first round, we see the three distinct camps that the population was divided into, which carried somewhat an equal weight. We have the centre right who are gravitating towards the incumbent president. We have the far right, which is obviously dominated by Le Pen. And then we have somewhat of a scattered left, led by Mélenchon. And so he obviously tried to prevent a rematch of 2017, and unfortunately, this has kind of left voters in a somewhat awkward position and feeling somewhat disenfranchised. And so across France, there seems to be I guess, a sense of lack of choice in terms of the voters in terms of the candidates that remain. And so the interest that the foreign media has in terms of the French election, because what is at stake here is, I guess, two different visions. I mean, we have the incumbent president who is a lot more focused on the European Union and obviously wants to enhance and solidify those relationships, especially the transatlantic relations in the form of NATO, and obviously also the multilateral relationships there. Now, in contrast, we have Marine Le Pen, who's a lot more of an ultra-nationalist and who is a lot more focused on being a protectionist in terms of the economy. And so, she has her vision and her stance in relation to NATO, and we can probably discuss that later, and as well as reimagining and re-envisioning what a Europe would look like. And she's already alluded to the point of a Europe alliance, alliance of nations. And so, although she's yet to spell out what this looks like, I believe that not only Europe, but as you mentioned, Karim, the rest of the world and the foreign media is looking closely to where France is heading in this direction.
Very nice indeed. Now I would like to address Mr. Abdenour Toumi here about the elections. What are the big issues? I mean, the war in Ukraine overshadowed early campaigning, but recent opinion polls suggest that the cost of living has become the single most important issue. What's your take on this?
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me. Yes, indeed, actually, the entire campaign appeared in a very, very actually awkward context, which is the healthcare crisis, I mean the pandemic crisis, the COVID, and then the Russia-Ukraine war broke out. And all this didn't, I would say, play a role in the narrative of the campaign, or at least in the first round of the campaign. However, the candidates themselves, and notably, I would say, the incumbent President Emmanuel Macron and the candidate of the far-right party, Marine Le Pen, there were this duality of two different projects and two different perspectives, domestically and internationally. However, Marine Le Pen ran an interesting campaign in the first round, and she focused on the purchasing of power because she knew well that the main thing or the most important concern of the voters, and notably on her side, were focusing on the cost of living, and that how the pandemic, the COVID-19, and later on the ongoing war in Ukraine have impacted directly their daily basis. As far as President Macron, he didn't show up to the race or campaign until the result of the first round, and he immediately reframed his campaign from the, let's say, the so-called commander-in-chief, and had that posture, and he positioned himself on that posture of the world leader, and of course with more experience on international issues in time of war. And we all remember he tried to position himself and play a mediator role in the pre-war between the two belligerent, the leader of the two belligerent countries, Vladimir Putin and Vladimir Zelensky. And as soon as the result showed up on that Sunday night of the first round, he knew well that he is really, really in danger and is not secured yet to take this election. However, as I said, he reframed his campaign into this actually very interesting. He moved from the center, from the right, the center right, to the center left, and this is what is going to be. I mean, the main game is on this issue, is focusing on the purchasing of power, because the French voters are really, really concerned. Now, the voters, are they enthusiastic and are they want to this? Not really, because if for them, and as your guest stated, it is not only a remake, but it sounds like Macron-Le Pen Act 2. Therefore, the majority of the voters are very, very, let's say, unhappy about this cast, and because they wished for a better candidate. But unfortunately, this goes back to the last 2 years, that the classic candidate, or that what we call it here, the conventional parties, which is very interesting, they were totally imploded, and they are the big losers from these elections, notably the Socialist Party that was imploded anyway in 2017 by President Macron, and then exploded in this election by Marine Le Pen and Eric Zemmour, and some from the Republican Party itself leaders. So now, to sum up all this, the voters today are casting their vote on going for the argument of the lesser of the two evils, and this argument is not holding well, because just as soon as the results come out tonight, tomorrow I will put this rugby metaphor, the third half, and will be the post-presidential election, and here will become the real game for the next June legislative elections.
Very well, thank you indeed. Let me include in the discussion Mr. Manuel Pouchelet. Other big issues here facing France are health, security, pensions, the environment and immigration. In January, France posted its strongest annual economic growth for half a century, bouncing back from the shock of the COVID-19 pandemic. Spiraling energy costs and rising inflation have hit everybody in the pocket. But generally, purchasing power is on the rise in France. What can you tell us more about this, Mr. Manuel Pouchelet?
Yes, today France has to face with a lot of challenges, as you mentioned in your commentary. But what we have to underline today, from 2017 on today in 2022, the big change is the end of the traditional parties and traditional party solutions. So we had the first result in the first round, of course, and today we have the two second candidate for the second round, which is Marine Le Pen for the second time and Mr. Macron. But if we have a look on their program, Mr. Macron has a program oriented with a foreign policy, Europe, and of course Ukraine today with the invasion of Ukraine. But Mrs. Le Pen has a specific program dealing mainly with the French society problems. So as you told us, retirement has become difficult for a lot of French citizens today because pensions are very low. Of course, the purchase power, it is due to the international footprint, which is very important now. Before, it wasn't taken into consideration for the French citizen, and today I think it has become the new topic of this election. But if we have a look on Mrs. Le Pen program, it deals with mainly a lot with the French society problems, retirement, employment, qualifications, everything like that. Instead of Mr. Macron is also orienting his program with the future. The environmental footprint, challenges for the future in new technologies, and of course, other topics mainly dealing with today with the international scene, of course. And that's why today, French voters, as the latest figures we had this morning, we had a light increase of participants for the French voters for this second round, and which is very important to take into account.
Very nice indeed. Thank you for these illustrations. And now let me invite you, dear viewers and dear guests, to follow with me these slides in which we explain France's presidential election system. Every 5 years, French voters directly elect a president through the same voting system that has been in place for generations. Paper ballots cast in person and counted by hand. Here, who is eligible to vote? All French nationals aged 18 and up. Whether or not they live in France, they are eligible to vote. And what are the election's main stages? Well, the release of official candidates list. Candidates must be nominated by at least 500 elected representatives to be considered official candidates. Examples include mayors and deputies. Campaigning for the election? Well, a committee is in charge of monitoring the budget limit. Once the official campaign begins, each candidate must receive an equal amount of TV and radio airtime. The election's first round For example, April 10th, 2022, for this election, the French people go to the polls. If no candidate receives more than 50% of the vote in the first round, a second round is held. And the second round this time is regarding April the 24th, 2022, which is today. Only the two candidates with the highest votes advance to the second round of the election. The candidate who receives the absolute majority of the vote or the votes cast is declared the winner. Here, I would like to ask Mr. Federica Setugalo about what he can tell us more about the democratic system in France. Is this practical? How did the French people end up choosing between Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen, who, according to many opposers, one is nul and the other is pire, i.e. One is bad and the other is worse?
Yes, thank you, Karim. And as I alluded to earlier in relation to the French democracy, I think one of the underlying issues that I see in the French system is France's abstention problem. And I mentioned earlier that there appears to be a lack of trust in the institutions. The policies don't necessarily align with the individual voters' expectations and the interests, and somewhat even a lack of quote unquote real action. And so, in recent elections, we have seen a rising number of abstentions and even violent protesting. And this, I believe, is a consequence of a dysfunctional system, that perhaps invests too much power and attention on the figure of the president. And so if the French people are unhappy about the situation, and then there needs to be a change in the system. And so what I probably suggest, or in terms of my analysis, is perhaps reducing the status of the presidency, largely to perhaps a ceremonial type role. It's kind of seen already in Europe and other republics such as Germany. And so, or at least, remove the president's right to name the prime minister, even call new elections, and even serve as commander-in-chief. And as Abdennour has already alluded to, it appears to be a selection of, between the two evils, or let's vote on the less of the two evils. And so this is the somewhat disenfranchised position that voters find themselves in. And it's very difficult because this issue of the abstention seems to be on the rise. And so if this is something that is very complex in nature, well, perhaps we do need to look at the overall system. And as you mentioned, Karim, this is the position that voters find themselves in. And I want to highlight the third biggest party was Mélenchon's party. My concern is that the majority of these voters will abstain from voting, or perhaps they would go with Macron in order to prevent a far-right candidate, such as Le Pen, from entering into power. So again, before we can actually address what we are dealing with today, we need to actually have a look at the whole French democracy system. So that's my stance on that question, Karim.
Mm-hmm. Very nice. What about you, Mr. Abdennour Toumi? Can you tell us, is the French election system a direct or indirect one? And how is this round system effective for the people to choose the right candidate?
No, I think there is actually the sentiment of a lack of trust toward politics in general and politicians in particular, because, we have been noticing in the last, I would say, 20 years, and the last, I would say, 3 French elections, the people, as it was stated earlier by your guest, are not really happy, and also to some extent angry. And we saw that in early term of President Macron with the movement of the Yellow Vest. And that movement that lasted almost a year and a half in weekly protests. And they actually touch on the real themes that are actually damaging the entire democratic process that France has been known for the last, 57 years under the Fifth Republic. But the main also question here is not only the voters, but also the media and the elite, how are approaching politics. Because unfortunately, lately they have, both media and the so-called elite, operation elite, they were touching on some sensitive, let's say, societal issues or themes, such as the Muslims, like the Islamic headscarf and so on. But all these change the dynamic of the real debate and what is politics, or what the politics is about, and what the voters are expecting from their eventually leaders. And also, France, unfortunately, as I said, if you notice, in 2000, both Nicolas Sarkozy and François Hollande, they weren't re-elected. To be fair to François Hollande, he didn't run for second term. But even with Macron today, actually, it's not a choice. They don't have any choice. They have just to stop the rise of the far right and the far right party. The question here goes back to what went wrong not with the French democratic process, but with the debate and, let's say, the French, I would say, politics thoughts, or a new school of thought that has appeared, that when we were young in mid-80s and early 90s, we had very, charismatic figures, such as Mitterrand, Giscard d'Estaing, Jacques Chirac, Seguin, Juppé lately, Lionel Jospin, Michel Rocard, and so on. But in these days, look, we get, I'm sorry, we get Eric Zemmour into the debate. And again, for Eric Zemmour, the character of Eric Zemmour in the storyline of this French campaign, because his, I would say, momentum slowed down or disappeared just because of the war. Otherwise, we will be discussing today the race of Eric Zemmour. So this is, again, it's not about the, I would say, the system itself, but it's about the men and women who are behind this system, who, unfortunately, these politicians, and we all know them, they became such a public servants, and they don't have, let's say, they lost that contact with their voters. And the message of the Yellow Vest movement in 2018, all the way to almost to 2020, early 2020, was all about that. And this is what I think, whoever will be the winner tonight, tomorrow he will or she will be facing a tough, I would say, challenges on this issue as well, adding to the economic and geopolitics questions to their challenges.
Very clear. Let me address Mr. Manuel Pouchelet now. Marine Le Pen spoke on various occasions about rebuilding the French Republic and changing the system. What does she mean here? What does she want to change exactly? And what doesn't work for her? How is the current system flawed, Mr. Manuel Pouchelet?
I think that Mrs. Le Pen expresses some specific, how can I say, opinion about the French system, political system, and of course the constitution of the Fifth Republic. So I think that she says that we are the first political party in France, and we are well not represented at the National Assembly. This is, I think, one of the main ideas. But concerning the French history of the French president, it has started in 1958 with President de Gaulle. Charles de Gaulle decided to have a strong power for the French president. And according to the text of the French constitution, the French president is a legitimate person because he is elected directly by the citizen, which is not the case for example, other important function in France. And that's why this high representative of France overseas is the French president, because he has also in charge treaties and so on. And at the moment, I don't think that if Mrs. Le Pen will be able to challenge or to face with this kind of new challenges today, because up to date, the Rassemblement National has only had some city halls in big cities, and we don't have a real I can say, a real review of what they have done already. Instead of Mr. Macron is, in fact, I can say, surfing on his latest review. I mean, the management of COVID-19 on today's Ukrainian crisis. And of course, all the foreign challenges, which is not the case of Mrs. Le Pen's speech. And that's why I think that Mrs. Le Pen complains, because she thinks that she's not well represented in all the French institutions, in fact.
Oh, very nice. Coming up next in our special coverage of the French election 2022. Analysis of the April 20th debate between the French candidates, centrist Emmanuel Macron and far-right leader Marine Le Pen, right after this break.
Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen faced each other in a 3 hours debate, addressing major issues for voters on the table, for reinforcing their chances to win the second round, counting cost of living, climate change, immigration, and mainly Russia-Ukraine conflict that overshadowed the campaign, in which Macron accused Le Pen of being dependent on Russia's power.
For our country, this is bad news, because you depend on Russian power, and you depend on Putin. Because a few months after saying that, Mrs., you took out a loan in 2015 from a Russian bank, the first Czech Russian bank, close to the government. You don't talk to other leaders, you talk to your banker when you talk about Russia. That's the problem, Madame Le Pen.
Le Pen opposed Macron's accusations, saying that her party had only taken the loan from Russia because French banks refused to lend to her.
Now, what you say is wrong, many times. First, I found you a tweet I made on November 9th, 2014. I support a free Ukraine that is not subject to either the United States, nor the European Union, nor to Russia. This is my position.
Another explosive clash dominated the debate when Le Pen confirmed that she would ban Muslim women from wearing headscarves in public, describing the veil as a uniform imposed by Islamists.
I am for the banning of the veil in the public space. I said it in the clearest way. I think that the veil is a uniform imposed by the Islamists.
On the other hand, President Macron accuses his far-right adversary of pushing for hatred, which might lead to a civil war if she goes down that path.
The question of the veil is the question of the religion, of a religious exterior sign. That's it. It's the question of the headscarf more exactly. I'm for the law of 1905. It's our republic. The republic is secular. Secularism is not about fighting a religion. And therefore, with me, there will be no ban on headscarf or the yarmulke or any religious sign in the public space.
Other issues have been addressed during the debate, including prices increase, which immediately took center stage of the campaign. Le Pen says 70% of the French standard of living had deteriorated over the past 5 years, while Macron said he had aimed to make France a stronger country.
The Mozart of finance, that's how we introduced you. I'm not saying you introduced yourself, but we introduced you. You have an economic record that is very bad. I forgot the 17,000 or 15,000 or 500,000 industrial jobs lost under your 5-year period, and the social toll that is even worse.
It is believed that Macron was seen as most presidential by 53 to 29, while many debate viewers say he had come across as arrogant and offensive. Analysts have warned that the result is far from foregone conclusion, with surveys indicating that over 10% of French who intended to cast their ballots have yet to decide who to vote for.
Well, let's hear from you, Mr. Federica Gallo. Counting the last hours for the final round, it was an attention-grabbing debate we have witnessed between the two traditional adversaries. One of the main issues of this presidential campaign has been the cost of living. Why is that the biggest issue, this time? Who do you think is more convincing regarding this issue, and whose proposals are cheaper and more expensive? Who do you think is more likely to win in general?
So I guess in terms of the cost of living, we're looking at the situation here, not only in France, but also in Europe. I believe the environment has been cultivated, for a far-right politician to be on the rise. And so I believe that, to an extent, Le Pen has done a great job at actually appealing directly to France's, working class voters. And as my colleagues have already mentioned, especially on the issues of purchasing power, energy prices, and also better living conditions. And so when you look at the contrast between, the urban areas as well as the rural areas, the cities and obviously all the small towns, Marine Le Pen has captured the heart of the people, or I guess, this is typical of a populist, rhetoric, claiming to be the voice and the representative of the people and for the people. And so in this instance, perhaps within the last 5 years, not much has actually shifted in terms of what is happening on the ground. And so I feel that to aid the rhetoric that Marine Le Pen has already put out there, it kind of is supported by Macron's position in terms of his focus on Europe as a whole, and obviously, being on the international stage. And his critics have mentioned that he's so disconnected from the average person, so disconnected from the average worker, and that he's a president more for the rich rather than the working class, or the working class feels that their voice is not being heard in this instance. So so in the case of Le Pen, running with this narrative, I feel that she has done a great job in terms of hearing what people are saying, especially in areas outside of Paris. And so she's obviously run with this rhetoric in order to gain support. And I think one of my colleagues has already alluded to the fact that I think what has supported Marine Le Pen in terms of advocating for changing the situation around the cost of living is the emergence of Zemmour. And so with his radical and extreme views, from the far right, it's kind of portrayed Le Pen as a somewhat less extreme candidate on the far right end. However, I feel that her core policies would not have shifted, and her core values would not have shifted. So I believe, again, she's playing politics, and if she does get elected as the next president of France, I believe that her stance will be very similar, if not the same, to her stance in 2017. Now, in terms of who is more convincing, I believe that Le Pen is more convincing in relation to the cost of living versus the Macron, I guess. Again, as I already mentioned, the disconnection between the people and Macron, and I guess his focus on more on the regional and international platforms, and somewhat, quote unquote, forgotten about the French people. And this can also be supported by the fact that Macron only started campaigning 8 days before the first round, whereas other candidates have been campaigning much longer than Macron has. So that's my analysis on that situation.
Very nice. Thank you so much. And Mr. Abdelnour Toumi, as we have watched in the report, the two candidates have striken two different visions regarding the EU. I mean, Emmanuel Macron is strongly pro-Europe, and you can see lots of European Union flags around. He says he wants to reshake the European Union and refound it. How do you think he's going to do that exactly? And what does he have for Europe? European army, digital sector, asylum policy and immigration. And what does Marine Le Pen, on the other hand, has?
Actually, as far as President Macron's European stance and doctrine, I mean, it is consistent, and he is a strong believer for the European Union and also European integral system. And we saw his, putting all his energy to play again, or at least position Europe or the EU in the conflict, in the ongoing war between the Russian-Ukraine war, and to try to distance himself, not himself, but as a leader of the European these months, from the hegemony of the Anglo-Saxon bloc that was set or was put in place. And we saw now how the US and the UK are playing this, I would say, front seat role in the Russian-Ukraine war. The problem with Macron now is, of course, Europe doesn't look good in the middle of this conflict, and also the outcome. We don't know how this war will last, but the outcome will be having a serious I would say, issues on Europe national security.
And speaking of national security, Emmanuel Macron did propose something about having a European army, didn't he? I mean, and now it's resurfacing. I think it's getting more support now.
But it's still on symbolic. I mean, there is nothing concrete. I mean, everything, when we speak about let's say, the so-called common foreign policy and defense policy, it's still on paper. But because, again, the fraction we notice, and this is not new, this is not popped up in the light of the Russia-Ukraine war. It was before, and we saw how the Germans were not that warm. So the idea today are shifting slowly their position, if not their doctrine on that. But when because the question you want to speak as like a block of an integral system, the entire Europe with, let's say, a common defense policy and foreign policy, it's very hard. So President Macron, if he's re-elected, I'm sure he will put the entire energy on this one. And I think it was an interesting piece yesterday in Le Journal Le Monde about his next foreign policy priorities will be focusing on the regional level and on the Russia-Ukraine war, not only as a mediator, facilitator for, as a peacemaker, but also for the entire Europe in this new era that will appear in the aftermath of the ongoing war. As far as Marine Le Pen, from day one, and this is not new, she didn't change much, even though she's trying to, I would say, to just twist the narrative of her origin plan or policy toward Europe. She is, just a month ago, before the campaign, she was calling for Brexit, and now she is changing her mind on that, and she's trying to, let's say, playing that, making the call toward the sovereignist here in France and trying to position France as a sovereign state and not give too much to the integral system.
Very nice indeed.
Integral system.
Thank you so much. What about you, Mr. Manuel Pouchelet? As Mr. Macron is ahead of the polls comparing to Le Pen, what issues addressed by both candidates would grab or, let me say, influence the undecided voters? And here also the file of hijab, banning hijab or the veil in public also came to the surface. What can you say about that? And what can we talk about the slogan of France, that is égalité, fraternité, liberté? What happens to that?
Yes, it's important to underline this because in France it's very important. Liberté, égalité, fraternité. This is the management of the French Republic. Okay, it's the main idea. And of course, I heard very interesting thing. I was a former military personnel. So concerning European Union, it was interesting. I had the opportunity to see the evolution of the European defense. The first meeting was former Yugoslavia war, and Europe was absent, even if it was only 2 hours from Paris at this time. It's the same with Ukraine too. But concerning France and concerning the two candidates, Mr. Macron has a good review concerning Europe influence, because Europe helped France during the COVID-19 crisis, and it seems that today in 2022, Europe is quite absent when Mr. Macron is asking for help. I'm talking about Sahel area with the French engagement of the French army fighting jihadists. And of course, today in Russia too, we have different positions with Germany. And it has become difficult to manage because Germany has their own position and France has also its own position. And of course, the speech of Mr. Macron is now more, I can say, motivated by his balance. Instead of Mrs. Le Pen always accuses Europe of the footprint of the European Union in the French citizens' life. She's talking about, of course, immigration. She's talking about purchase power, taxes, and so on. And maybe that is a big difference between the two candidates today in the speech at the moment. So that's why we are waiting in June the legislative election, and maybe we will have to face with a cohabitation. I mean, mosaic of political parties were out the first round, and maybe we'll come back for the political debate in June for the legislative with the election of the member of parliaments.
The final phase of our show, we will go to this break and then we come back to delineate point by point the debate that happened between Le Pen and Emmanuel Macron. So, point number one in the debate was the cost of living. Le Pen considered bringing down energy prices and thus cost of living priority for her program. Macron repeatedly challenged his opponents' proposals as unworkable. And here let me ask Mr. Fitiri Situgalo. Energy prices are skyrocketing in Europe due to Russia-Ukraine crisis. How will both candidates face this major challenge?
Well, again, going on from the debate, I feel that, again, there are two visions, running side by side, and we'll have two different approaches as well. And I feel like Marine Le Pen has the upper hand in terms of, as I alluded to earlier on, in terms of convincing her voters and even the French population in terms of how she would handle the issue of the cost of living. Now, she is proposing some radical proposals in relation to the economy and also the monetary policies. She is defending her proposals, which also includes the abolishing of the income tax for the under 30s and helping me hard up, with the France cost of living as we're discussing now. And again, this is from a platform of a ultra-nationalist perspective and in terms of the separation of investment and retail banking. And again, the energy diversification. And whilst, she has mentioned the energy diversification, she is not for energy renewables, and again is wanting to focus a lot more on the nuclear side of energy. And so I guess from the perspective of the increase of energy, well, that was probably one of her main criticism of President Macron in terms of the sanctions that are applied in Russia. While she has supported the condemnation of the invasion, while she stopped short of speaking about the sanctions that are applied on the Russian gas, because she believes that the people who are most impacted in this situation are again the French or the population. And so she has perhaps a wider scope in terms of how to approach this, but again, it's coming from a nationalistic perspective and also a protectionist perspective. And she does have a focus more on the domestic market and a lot more as opposed to the international market. And so she is looking at obviously implementing tariffs and in order to minimize the French reliance, not only regionally, but also internationally. But although this is the case, I believe that it will also damage the relations within the European Union, not only from a diplomatic perspective, but also from an economic perspective. Macron has worked the last 5 years on deepening the integration of the European Union. And so whilst this is the case for Le Pen, I believe that for Macron, well, I guess it'll be business as usual for Macron, for what he's developed the last 5 years. And again, he just needs to be a lot more connected to the people in terms of his economic policies. Whilst his fiscal policies have, helped most of the economic groups, again, the criticism is that the benefits are more tailored towards the wealthy, who had been, taxed heavily under, previous ministers. Now, whilst he is criticised in this area, some of my colleagues have already mentioned that we have seen quite a significant growth that hasn't been seen in the last 50 years. So to Macron's defence, he would also handle the situation of cost of living, this is his area.
Now, speaking of Macron's criticism, I would like to bring Mr. Abdenour Toumi here into the discussion and ask him, Macron is being labelled as the president of the rich. To what extent is this true? And second point, in our detailed illustration, we will tackle the Russia-Ukraine war just right after that. Mr. Abdenour Toumi. How far is labeling Emmanuel Macron president of the rich true?
I mean, I think it's very hard to argue about that because I mean, sure, he came from that Ivy School of Lina and his political, I mean, he didn't have, I would say, political heritage, and he was one, I mean, like in 2017, as a new face and fresh, young, not politician, but he ran as like, I would say, and then, I mean, that's why he labeled his first term as startup administration. And therefore, his connection with, let's say, the rural France and the classic French, I would say, bistros people didn't match with them because of his some attitude in his governing style that he set early in his first term, especially when started very interesting point, and we are missing here is when he started with the Benalla or Alexandre Benalla Gate, and that time when the press started to, I mean, challenge him on that, he used, I'm paraphrasing him, I mean, can't catch me if you can. And that, I mean, that phrase, I mean, like upset many French, not only the media and the, I would say, the intellectuals, but also the average person, French person. Then again, I'm going to insist on this, then came up the issue of the yellow vest and how he dealt with the movement in the first, I would say, weeks. So therefore, he has that image, or he showed that image of not connected with the real French, alike, for instance, Jacques Chirac, for instance, or don't go that far with General de Gaulle, even François Mitterrand. So France and French voters and French people, they like their leaders. As it was stated earlier by one of their guests, it is, I mean, an election of the president who, I mean, it's direct contact with the people, and the people feels like they have this vision with their candidate and eventually their president. President Macron, when he was elected in 2017, he didn't have all these characteristics that damage his image and also put him sounds like the president of the rich. And also, I mean, there is this classic, I would say, reproach to him is by, like, when it comes to high taxations and also not taxing the rich and so on.
Very nice. Second point in our detailed illustration is the Russia's war in Ukraine. Emmanuel Macron accused Le Pen of depending on Russian power and on Mr. Putin, citing a loan of 9 million euros taken out in 2014 by the National Front. She explained that she was forced to go and make a loan abroad in the face of the refusal of French banks. And here, let me bring Mr. Emmanuel Pouchelet. What's your stand with regard to the loan of 9 million euros taken out in 2014 by the National Front?
Yes, in fact, this loan is one of the aspects of how runs the Rassemblement National today. This political movement need to have finances to deliver its speech, and of course, French banks refused to give some money on to finance on to loans for this political party, because as soon as you give a support to Rassemblement National, it has become difficult because a lot of French citizens are aware of the speech, are aware of the speech disseminated through the population. And you could be accused or maybe boycott if you finance or if you support this political party. So that's why the influence of Russia in this context is proved today. But during the debate, which was given on Wednesday night, Mr. Macron accused Mrs. Le Pen, and Mrs. Le Pen replied that French banks refused to give her loans, so that's why she had to escape from France on from French boundaries to get her loan. So, because Mrs. Le Pen represents some French views, and she's, as I told before, she's upset about the situation because she can't express her representativity, in fact, because of laws, of a legislative system and political system run by the Fifth Constitution. So today, I think that Mrs. Le Pen, she will be an important person, and we will have a look. We will have a look on June legislative coming election, and I think that maybe a representative of Rassemblement National will increase. And we have to come back and to debate about this future situation, I think.
And next in our illustration is the European Union. Macron judges that Le Pen's project consists of bringing France out of the EU. Le Pen wishes to build a Europe of nations and no longer leave the European Union. Here, as last question, since we're running out of time and it's the last minute in our show, Mr. Fitri Casito, Gallo, bringing France out of the EU was a major project for Marine Le Pen in 2017. Why this radical change?
Well, again, it just aligns with her vision of, France first. She's a nationalist, she's an ultra-nationalist. And so her vision is for French people versus the EU. And this is in contrast with Macron. He's obviously pro-European, pro-international. And so whilst this was her stance in 2017, and she may be seen as having a less extreme perspective, but as I alluded to earlier on, if she is elected, I believe she will go back to her 2017 stance, and this could mean trouble for Brussels, and we would see the shockwaves across the international platform. So the Europe of nations, she's yet to spell out what this actually looks like, but she is in favor of respecting, French sovereignty and French independence, and this goes across the European Union as well as NATO.
Very nice. Any final word, Mr. Abdelnour, to me, a few seconds before we wrap it up?
Sure. I mean, let's keep the suspense going for the outcome for tonight, but I think this election is not finished yet. And then we'll start by tomorrow, and then we will look in June for the legislative elections, and it's going to be very, very hard for either winner.
Thank you so much, dear guests, for your thorough analysis. Thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here on All 24 News. With this, ladies and gentlemen, our special coverage of the presidential elections comes to an end. Thank you for tuning in, and bye for now.